Europe's housing crisis isn't about homes anymore. It's about mental survival. A 29-year-old man in London earns more money than his parents ever did. He has a good job, a degree, no criminal record, no addictions. And yet, every night, he sleeps in the same childhood bedroom he grew up in at age 12. Not because he wants to, because leaving feels financially impossible. And he's not alone. Across Europe, millions of people are quietly entering a new kind of crisis. Not just economic, psychological. People are delaying relationships, avoiding children, living with constant anxiety, losing motivation, losing identity. At first, it looked like a housing problem. But what's happening now runs much deeper than rent prices. Because when an entire generation stops believing they can build a future, something inside society starts to break.
The strange thing about psychological crises is that they usually begin silently. No alarms, no dramatic collapse, just tiny changes in human behavior. People stop making long-term plans. Friends move away. Relationships become temporary. Birth rates fall. Conversations change. And then one day, an entire generation wakes up feeling emotionally stuck. That's exactly what's happening across Europe right now. In cities like London, Dublin, Amsterdam, Berlin, Lisbon, Stockholm, and Paris, housing prices have transformed from stressful to emotionally destabilizing. For years, people treated this like a simple economic story. Too many people, not enough homes, interest rates, inflation. But psychologists, sociologists, and even employers are starting to notice something darker underneath it all. The housing crisis is changing how people think, how they date, how they work, how they sleep, how they imagine their future. And once that happens, the damage becomes much harder to reverse. Because humans can survive struggle, but uncertainty changes people, especially when it lasts for years. A few decades ago, adulthood in much of Europe followed a rough pattern.
You got a job, maybe rented a small apartment, eventually bought a place, built stability, slowly. It wasn't easy, but it felt possible. That feeling mattered more than people realized, because hope is deeply connected to psychology. Not fantasy, not optimism. Hope. The belief that your effort can eventually improve your life. But for many young Europeans today, that connection is breaking. In parts of Europe, average rent now consumes over half of a young worker's income. Buying property feels almost mythical. Even highly educated professionals are living with roommates into their 30s. And the emotional effect is difficult to describe unless you've lived it. Imagine working hard for years and still feeling like life never actually begins. You're technically surviving, but emotionally suspended. And this is where the crisis becomes invisible. Because externally, many people still look functional. They go to work, post photos online, meet friends for coffee, smile during conversations. But internally, there's a growing feeling of instability that follows them everywhere. A quiet thought repeating in the background. What exactly am I building? That question has become hauntingly common, especially in cities where housing has turned into permanent uncertainty.
In Berlin, some workers spend months competing for tiny apartments alongside hundreds of applicants. In Dublin, professionals with solid salaries struggle to move out independently. In parts of Spain and Italy, Young adults remain financially dependent on family far longer than previous generations. At first glance, these seem like economic statistics, but hidden inside them are psychological consequences. Because housing is not just shelter. Housing represents safety, control, identity, privacy, adulthood. And when people lose access to those things for too long, their mental state slowly changes. Researchers have already linked housing instability to rising anxiety, chronic stress, depression, burnout, and social withdrawal. But what's even more unsettling is how normalized it's becoming. People joke about it now. I'll never own a house. I'll be renting forever. I'll probably live with roommates at 40. The humor helps hide the emotional exhaustion underneath. But eventually, exhaustion leaks into everything else. Work becomes harder to care about. Relationships become harder to commit to. The future becomes harder to picture. And then, society enters dangerous territory.
Because when enough people stop believing in stability, they stop investing emotionally in the future itself. This is already affecting birth rates across Europe. Many couples are delaying children, not because they don't want families, but because they don't feel secure enough to start one. Think about that for a second. An economic problem has become intimate. People are redesigning their entire emotional lives around instability. And it gets even stranger. In some cities, people are no longer choosing where to live based on happiness or opportunity. They're choosing based on survival calculations. Who has the cheapest rent? Which friend can share a flat? Which relationship makes living costs easier? Which country still feels affordable? Love, friendships, careers, identity, all slowly reorganized around housing pressure. And this creates a psychological environment of constant negotiation. Nothing feels permanent. Not jobs, not homes, sometimes not even relationships. That level of instability changes how the brain processes life. Humans are not designed to remain emotionally uncertain forever. Eventually, people adapt by lowering expectations. That may be the most dangerous part of all. Not outrage, resignation. Because resignation spreads quietly. A generation begins expecting less from life. Less stability, less ownership, less freedom, less hope.
And once expectations shrink, societies can drift for years without realizing the emotional cost. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The crisis isn't only affecting low-income workers anymore. Doctors, engineers, teachers, designers, software developers, even people with good jobs increasingly feel trapped. That completely changes the psychology of achievement. For decades, society taught people a simple formula. Study hard, work hard, build a future. Now millions are discovering that the formula no longer guarantees stability. And psychologically, that creates confusion. Because humans can tolerate hardship better when hardship feels temporary. But when people begin feeling that the system itself no longer leads anywhere meaningful, motivation collapses. You can already see signs of this everywhere. Burnout rates rising. Young workers emotionally disengaging. People abandoning expensive cities entirely. Others refusing promotions because higher salaries barely improve quality of life after rent increases.
Even ambition starts to feel distorted. Some people work obsessively, terrified of falling behind financially forever. Others mentally check out completely. Both reactions come from the same underlying fear. What if stability never arrives? And social media makes the emotional pressure even worse. Every day, people scroll through images of beautiful apartments, perfect kitchens, city lofts, dream homes.
Meanwhile, many are living in overcrowded spaces, temporary rentals, or tiny rooms with almost no privacy. That gap between expectation and reality creates a constant psychological friction, a feeling of personal failure, even when the problem is structural. And over time, that feeling becomes deeply isolating, especially for young men and women entering adulthood. Because home has always symbolized something bigger than walls. It symbolizes progress. Without that feeling of progress, people begin drifting emotionally. Some become angry. Others become numb. Many become quietly anxious all the time. And perhaps the most disturbing part, governments can measure inflation, interest rates, construction numbers, but emotional hopelessness is much harder to quantify. There's no graph that perfectly captures what happens when millions of people slowly lose belief in their future. Yet the effects appear everywhere. Lower trust, lower optimism, political frustration, social fragmentation, even loneliness. Because unstable housing affects social life more than people realize. When people move constantly, live with strangers, or cannot create stable homes, community weakens. Neighbors stop knowing each other. Friend groups scatter across cities. People postpone commitment. Society becomes emotionally temporary. And temporary people rarely build long-term trust. That's why this crisis feels different from ordinary economic downturns. It's not just reducing wealth. It's reshaping human behavior itself. And ironically, many people still don't fully recognize what's happening to them psychologically. They just feel tired, constantly tired. Tired of searching, tired of calculating expenses, tired of uncertainty, tired of waiting for life to finally begin. But there's one detail that makes this story surprisingly human. Even in the middle of all this instability, people are adapting in unexpected ways. Across Europe, new forms of living are emerging. Friends intentionally building shared homes together. Young families leaving major cities for smaller towns. Communities creating cooperative housing models. People redefining success away from ownership alone. Not because they gave up completely, but because psychologically, humans always search for stability somewhere, even when traditional systems fail. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden underneath this entire crisis. The deepest damage was never only financial. It was emotional. Because when housing becomes permanently uncertain, life itself starts feeling temporary. Dreams become delayed. Relationships become cautious. Identity becomes unstable. And eventually, people stop asking, how do I build a good future? They start asking, can I even afford one?
That shift changes societies more than most politicians realize, because
Civilizations are not held together by concrete. They're held together by belief. The belief that effort matters, that stability is possible, that tomorrow can improve. And when enough people lose that belief at the same time, the consequences spread far beyond housing markets. They spread into culture, mental health, relationships, birth rates, politics, human behaviour itself. Which means Europe's housing crisis may become remembered for something much bigger than expensive apartments. It may become remembered as the moment millions of people quietly stopped feeling psychologically secure inside modern life. And once a society loses that feeling, getting it back is far harder than building new homes.